Well, good morning and welcome to the very, very smoky northeast Victoria, because half of the state is on fire. Typical summertime here. Lots of dry, not much rain, hot conditions and bushfires. But today what I want to do is talk about my CRF450L after 2,500 kilometres of riding since over the last 4 months, and have a talk about the bike. I know a lot of people have been interested in hearing specifics about the bike, so I thought that I'd have a talk about it. So these are just my opinions on my bike. I don't review bikes. I have never owned an enduro bike before, so I can't really compare it. But I have owned a lot of bikes, and so I can talk to you about what I use this bike for and why I got it and what I hope to do with it in the future, and some of its capabilities and some of its limitations. So I suppose it's worth talking about how I ended up on a 450 enduro coming off a CRF1000. And the answer is, I think that there's three of us in our normal riding group, and we all had larger bikes. We had a KTM 1190, a KTM 1090 and the Africa Twin, and I think we all came to the realisation that we prefer shorter trips with local trips that aren't overnights. You know, we've all got families and that sort of thing, so the big bikes are great for long trips. They're fantastic, they're comfortable, you can punch out 1,000 kilometres a day on them if you really want to, and they're super comfortable and super stress-free when you're travelling long distances. But for the type of riding we're going to do, and that includes another Simpson crossing in the next year or so, they were just too big. And I know guys do it all the time, and yeah, you know, I've done it, I've crossed it on the big bike, but it isn't what I would call overly enjoyable all of the time. In fact, some parts are just extremely hard work. So we had one of our guys, he brought a KTM 500, the other guy, he brought a Husky 501, and I was lining up to buy a WR450F, but the dealer, he advised me to wait just a few months or a month or so and have a look at this bike when it came out. The thing everyone talks about with this bike is the maintenance requirements. So what it needs is oil every 1,000 kilometres, oil and filter. And for me, that's probably 2 fairly big trips, you know, 500 kilometre weekend sort of thing would be normal. So, you know, 2 big trips on the bike. Oil and filter change and air filter change, and that probably takes about 30 minutes. So I rebuild at 32,000, oil and filter every 1,000, valve check every 3,000. That doesn't say valve adjustment, it says valve check. So that's pretty good news. The de-restriction consists of a new ECU, a different air intake between the air filter and the intake manifold, which is de-restricted, and you remove the top of the airbox cover, because the airbox cover on this one is actually a bit different than the US version. I didn't realise until I had a look at some videos from the American guys, and you can see that it's got a much wider intake on it. Okay, so have a bit of a look at the bike. It's a 450, it's got a 21-inch front wheel and an 18-inch rear wheel, which I have Dunlop 606s on, which I've always run on it. I swapped them out as soon as I bought the bike. This rear has 2,500 kilometres on it, and it's doing pretty good. It's got a little bit left, it'll probably get me to 3,000. And that's great. They've been great so far with heavy-duty tubes and rim locks put in. Other things I've done to it are obviously bark busters, double take mirrors, and some fat bars. I didn't like the stock bars. They were very, very rigid. I didn't like the feel of it because they've got the cross brace. So I had these in the shed and I whacked those on it. The IMS 11.3 litre or 3 gallon tank, which has been excellent. It fits beautifully, not a single problem Went straight on. Very, very well made. Not a very heavy tank either, which is nice. And that's good for about 250 kilometres. With general dual sport riding, your fuel reserve light will come on at about 200 k's, which is pretty good. Comes with nice wide foot pegs, comes with a foldy bit, and I've replaced the front sprocket cover with a B&B off-road cover, just so I can see the sprocket, make sure everything's going alright, and a B&B bash plate underneath. Now, it comes with a plastic plate over it, but your coolant reservoir is behind the bash plate, so I'd want a fairly hefty guard over that personally, because it's in a fairly vulnerable position where it is, and there's some pretty big dents in the bash plate after riding the rocky roads around Dargo, so I'm glad that's there. I haven't done a lot else to it. It doesn't need a lot else. The seat's horrendous. It's very uncomfortable, and there's a seat concept seat on the way. It's probably not bad compared to enduro saddles, but for dual sporting, I'm replacing it. Other things about the bike, not much. It takes 1.15 litres of oil to change it with a filter. The air filter's under the seat. I have a spare one which I keep oiled for quick changeover, and it's got a tiny little Honda oil filter under here, which is easy enough to get to. It takes, like I said, about 30 minutes to service the bike completely, and it's not particularly difficult to do. That's the bike so far. I haven't done much else to it other than put a USB socket up the front, which wasn't very difficult, and I've put an hour meter on it for no real reason, because I don't run it off hours, I run it off kilometres, because of the type of riding I do it would be fairly gentle riding. The bike's more than capable of maintaining road speeds. It will cruise at 100 kilometres an hour with absolutely no problems whatsoever. It will cruise at 110 on the freeways in Australia. That's our limit, 110 kilometres an hour, and it has plenty of overtaking and acceleration at 110. It has no problems at all. If you come across a log on a track, it's very easy to loft the front end up, and if it's under about 6 inches, you can just run it over with the suspension. It does very well. And it's obviously water cooled, and it has a thermofan which rarely ever kicks in, even in hot weather. Kicks in when it needs it, but it has to be pretty extreme slow moving stuff for that to kick in. It has dual radiators, and they do a really good job of keeping the bike cool. There's no adverse heat from the engine when you're riding. It's nice, it's comfortable. Ergonomics wise, it's good to stand up. I needed the bars up about 1 inch, so I've done that, and switched to a tapered bar from Tag, which I just had in the shed. It's no particular preference, I just had one. Air filters for this cost around $80 Australian. I have two that I swap when I change the oil. So like all bikes, they have limitations. This bike has obviously a fairly short fuel range. No one makes a larger tank yet than IMS. So you're looking at around that 250 kilometre range between fuel stations without carrying additional fuel. And the service interval of 1,000 kilometres. So some of the trips we've done through Central Australia, that's a day, 1 day between oil changes. So in all practicality, the bike isn't suitable for that type of trip. Bikes like the WR250R, although performance-wise the suspension isn't comparable, the engine isn't comparable, would be like of more benefit in that situation, because you can run them out to 10,000 kilometres theoretical oil change intervals. So fuel range and service intervals are this bike's limits, but knowing that when you buy it is okay, because 90% of your rides, or at least 90 if not 95% of the rides I do, are well under 1,000 kilometres. And in Victoria here we've got a lot of great off-road riding, just endless off-road riding with towns spattered throughout the place for fuel and food and that sort of thing as well. So the need to carry huge amounts of equipment is not as high. The advantages of the bike, major maintenance intervals are 32,000 kilometres. So valve checks, oil changes and air filter changes are all things you can do yourself, and there are reviews of guys doing 5,000 kilometre trips on these, or 3,000 kilometre trips I think, and changing the oil at different towns, which you can do if you're prepared to do that. And if you accept that as part of what the bike is, then that's fine. If you're expecting, you know, a 450 Enduro that's been tweaked to be more durable, to be able to ride across Australia with no maintenance, well, it's probably unrealistic, and you need to have a look at a different bike. And there's a few, and they're good, so you know that's an option. The oil change is cheap. It doesn't need a lot. The filters are cheap. They're $10 to $15 each. That's not a big deal. And there's only one. So unlike the KTMs where there's screens everywhere and filters, there's multiple things to change, which isn't a big deal. It doesn't take very long. But on this, there's one oil filter, and it's nice and easy to get to. The only complication I've had is even using a torque wrench, I have snapped off the oil filter cover bolt. It just torqued in half, broke in half. Which I replaced with an aftermarket bolt, and I haven't had any trouble since. So the engine in this bike is really nice. It's got a broad, friendly power range, and is quite difficult to stall once you get used to it. A little snatchy off the bottom, but once you're used to the throttle, you don't even notice. And the suspension is excellent. A little firm at low speed, but when you start to push the bike, it starts to perform really well and becomes very stable and has no, you know, it's well dampened. There's no unpredictable rebounding or wallowing or anything like that. Other things, another change for this bike over some of the other bikes in the category is that it has quite a good rear subframe. It's got a very strong tubular aluminium subframe that runs right through to the back of the fender, and I've carried overnight gear on that without any problems whatsoever. So that rear subframe also lets me not only carry the overnight gear, but lets me carry an additional fuel tank, which gives me a range of 350 kilometres of average riding. So that's not too bad for a little bike. A couple of the good things about this bike's instruments is that it's got front wheel base speed sensing, so it doesn't matter what I do to the gearing, it doesn't change, it just stays the same. It's great. It's fairly accurate. It's within about 5 kilometres an hour. But my favourite feature about the bike is that it has fuel consumed measured out for you per trip meter that you reset. So I run trip A as my refuel meter, and it'll tell me to within less than 100 mil how much fuel I've used. So there's no fuel gauge, so to speak, but if this says I've used 8.6 litres, you can bet that when you fill it up at the Bowser, you're putting 8.6 litres of fuel in it, which is fantastic for estimating your fuel range or how much more you've got left. And the other thing I do is I run the B trip meter as the service meter. So when I change the oil, I reset B, and when I change the fuel, I reset A. And it's really good because at any time I can flick down and see how many Ks I've done since I've changed the oil, or I can flick over and see how many litres of fuel I've got left in my tank. And it doesn't matter what size tank you buy for the bike. So if they make 18 litre tanks for this, or you run the standard tank, or you've got this 11.3 litre tank, it's really good because if you know the volume of your tank, you can just look down and see how much fuel you've got left, which is excellent. I think it's the best feature. It's one of the best features on the bike, even though it doesn't have a fuel gauge. just pulled into Beechworth for a rest, for a chill out, and we'll keep riding this way for a bit. Might do the Buckland Gap, might zip up my tank bag before I lose my wallet. One of the cool things that Wolfman does is they have these yellow tags, and you can just look down. So I guess, you know, I can talk about if it suits me, and I think this bike does suit me, but I suppose who's it going to suit in general, and that's someone who doesn't mind doing maintenance on their bike, basic maintenance, doesn't really want to change pistons and rings and things like that, or timing chains, but he's happy to do air filters and oil changes and check the valves occasionally. In that case, and who wants a capable off-road 450, well, you know, it's not a bad choice. I think it's pretty good. This doesn't have cush sprockets. It just doesn't. So I always thought, oh great, it comes with cush sprockets, that's a fantastic idea. They're not cush sprockets. They're steel sprockets, solid steel sprockets with a rubber thingy on it to stop the chain making noise. So just to demonstrate what I mean, you can pull this rubber back on the sprocket and see that it is just a solid metal sprocket that this chain runs on the rubber to make it quieter. It's just there to support the chains to make it not as noisy. It doesn't dampen anything. Another thing which I forgot to talk about before, this pipe gets really very hot, but underneath there is a shield and a piece of plastic and then this plastic. So when you put soft luggage on it, it doesn't get hot at all. Like I've ridden with all of my soft luggage on there, and not a problem. No, it didn't melt or didn't have any problems whatsoever. So that's just a handy little side note as well.